All right, so welcome. We're going to be diving into a case from Bermuda using excerpts from the actual court judgment. So this has been the deep dive.
It has.
Thanks for listening.
And thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
In this podcast, there could be mistakes, so please check the source material. Enjoy exploring and have a great day.
The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not intended as legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. While efforts are made to ensure accuracy, the information discussed may not reflect the most current legal developments and is subject to change. For advice on specific legal issues, consult a qualified attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. The opinions expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of any organizations they are affiliated with. By watching this video, you acknowledge and agree to this disclaimer.
All right, let's dive into data protection, Bermuda style. We're going through some excerpts from their Personal Information Protection Act from 2016, actually. It's a pretty hefty document, but we're going to see what's in there. Really get informed.
Absolutely. This act is fascinating, It's a look at how like a major international business hub, grapples with safeguarding personal information.
Yeah, it's not all just beaches and cocktails in Bermuda. They've got to make sure that companies are handling sensitive data responsibly, right? And this act lays down the law. So what's the big picture here? What kind of data are we talking about?
Think of any information that could be used to identify you, like your name, address, online activity, all of that. It's all fair game. And the act actually applies to both digital and like hard copy information, as long as it's part of a structured system.
Okay, so my grocery list on a sticky note is safe, but my online shopping history, that's a different story.
Exactly. And those targeted ads, the ones that seem to follow you around the internet,
Yeah.
the act is trying to regulate that too. It's all about finding a balance,
Yeah.
Protect individual rights, but let businesses still do their thing.
Right, because data is kind of like the currency of the digital age, isn't it? But it can't be misused. So we need these rules. Speaking of rules, are there any quirky exceptions in this act? I hear Bermuda has a thing for history, so.
Oh, you bet. There's an exclusion for information about someone who's been dead for at least 20 years. It's like they're saying, rest in peace. Your data is safe now.
That's great. So those historical figures, their secrets are protected.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what juicy bits they're keeping under wraps. But seriously, why that specific time frame?
Probably boils down to balancing privacy with historical access, After 20 years, the harm to a person's privacy kind of diminishes and the historical value of their data, it increases.
Okay, that's a good point. It's like drawing a line in the sand between respecting the past and protecting the present. Okay, so this act covers a lot of ground. What are the key principles that kind of underpin all of this?
Well, if I had to pick one word, it'd be consent. The act makes it clear that organizations generally need your permission to use your data.
So no more sneaky data collection. They actually have to ask.
They do, but of course there are a few exceptions. For example, if you're commenting on a public forum online, there's a reasonable expectation that other people are going to see that.
Right, you're putting it out there for the world. But what about those situations where they really need your data? Like in an emergency or something?
Exactly. If someone's life is on the line, there's not always time to get consent. The act recognizes that. But in most cases, it's all about being upfront, getting that permission.
Okay, consent is key. But what about how that data is used? Can they just gather everything and use it for whatever they want?
Not at all. That's where the principle of purpose limitation comes in. Organizations can only use your data for the reason you agreed to. No bait and switch tactics.
So no more signing up for a free trial and then getting bombarded with unrelated marketing emails.
The act's trying to stop that. It goes even further with the principle of proportionality. They can't hoard your data just in case, only what's necessary and relevant.
So no more keeping my shoe size on file just because I bought a pair of socks from them once. I like that.
Exactly. It's about preventing that kind of data hoarding. Companies need to justify what they're collecting and holding on to.
Makes sense. But let's be real, not all data is created equal. Some stuff is way more sensitive.
Absolutely. We're talking about things like your race, your health details, religious beliefs, political opinions, anything with a high risk of being misused, for discrimination or harm.
Yeah, that stuff needs extra protection. So how does the act handle those sensitive categories?
It puts them in a special category with stricter rules. Consent is almost always required. And organizations have to meet a higher standard, before using this information.
It's good to know the Act recognizes that some data needs more care. What about our rights? What control does this Act give individuals over their information?
This is where the Act gets really interesting. It gives you quite a bit of power. You have the right to access your data, to know how it's being used, and to request corrections if something is wrong. You can also ask organizations to stop using your data for marketing, or if you believe it's causing harm.
So you're not just a passive recipient of data collection.
Right.
You actually have agency.
You do.
What else can we do?
Well, Bermuda gives you the right to request the deletion of irrelevant data. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah. It's like hitting the delete button on parts of your digital footprint.
It is. It reflects a growing recognition that individuals should have the right to be forgotten. In certain circumstances, of course, there are exceptions, but it's a significant step towards empowering people.
So we've got consent, purpose limits, special protection for sensitive data, and even the right to be forgotten in some cases. Sounds pretty good on paper. But how does Bermuda actually make sure these rules are followed? What's stopping a company from going rogue?
That's where the Privacy Commissioner comes in. They're tasked with monitoring compliance with the Act. They can investigate complaints, issue orders to organizations that are breaking the rules, and even pursue legal action.
So there are actual consequences for violating the Act. It's not just a feel-good document.
Not at all. It's got teeth. The Act isn't just guidelines. It's got real power.
That's reassuring. Now, as we were digging through this Act, there were a few specifics that really, piqued our curiosity. For instance, there's an exemption for communication providers. Why are they treated differently?
That's a great question. It seems to suggest that lawmakers recognize the unique role these companies play in facilitating communication and data flow. Think about internet service providers, telecom companies. They transmit data, but they don't necessarily control how it's used.
Ah, so they're like the digital pigeons, right?
Yeah.
Not responsible for the gossip they carry.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Trying to hold them accountable for every piece of data that flows through their systems would be a nightmare.
Precisely. It would be an impossible task. But it's important to remember that this exemption doesn't give them free rein. They still have to comply with other laws and regulations.
Right, and they're still subject to oversight from regulators. It's more about recognizing the practical realities of their role. Now, what about that honors exemption? That one really piqued my interest. What could be so sensitive about giving someone an award?
I know, right? It's a bit of a head-scratcher. The Act states that it doesn't apply to the use of personal information for the purpose of, conferring honors or dignities by the crown or premier.
So if someone's being nominated for, knighthood, the usual data protection rules don't apply, what kind of information could be so top secret?
Well, think about things like background checks or letters of recommendation. That kind of information can be quite sensitive, and revealing it could harm someone's reputation or their chances of receiving the honor.
Makes sense. It's like, congrats on the knighthood, but sorry, we can't tell you who nominated you.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance between transparency and protecting the integrity of the process. It definitely raises some interesting questions. Maybe there's a fascinating story or two buried in there somewhere.
Oh, now you've got me thinking.
Oh.
All right, we've covered a lot here. Consent, purpose limits, those fascinating exemptions. It's a lot to digest.
It is, but it gives you a good sense of how Bermuda approaches data protection. They're trying to strike that balance between individual rights and the needs of businesses. They're thinking about the practicalities, the historical context, and even those quirky little details.
Yeah, it's way more nuanced than I expected. But let's get down to, brass tacks here. How does this Act actually play out in everyday life? Can you give us a real-world example? Okay, so let's say I'm a business owner in Bermuda, and I'm launching a new line of swim trunks. But they're fancy tech-infused swim trunks with built-in GPS for, this safety-conscious beachgoer.
Sounds high-tech. So naturally, you're going to want to collect data from your customers. Maybe their location preferences, swimming habits, maybe even their favorite beachside cocktail.
Exactly. Got to keep those targeted ads relevant. But with this Act in place, I can't just go crazy with data collection anymore.
Right. The Act's got you covered. You need to be upfront with your customers. Tell them exactly what data you're gathering, why you need it, and how you plan to use it. Think of it like a data transparency parade. Full disclosure.
So no more hiding behind walls of text in the terms and conditions.
Not a chance. You need a clear, easy-to-understand privacy notice that even someone in a beach daze can grasp.
So I can't bury it on page 57 of my website.
You got it. And of course, you need their consent before you start collecting data.
Okay, consent. Got it. But what does real consent actually look like? Can I just pre-check those consent boxes and call it a day?
Nice try. But the Act is smarter than that. It emphasizes that consent has to be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. No sneaky tactics.
So no more, like, tricking people into agreeing to something they don't understand.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to make informed choices about their data.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Data rights shouldn't disappear just because someone is wearing a swimsuit. Okay, so I've got my privacy notice. I'm getting consent. What happens if a customer changes their mind later on? Like, what if they suddenly decide they don't want me tracking their every swim stroke?
That's where those individual rights we talked about come in. They have the right to access the data, ask for corrections if something's wrong, and even request that you delete their data in certain circumstances.
So it's not a set it and forget it situation. I have to be ready to respond to those requests.
Absolutely. The Act puts the individual in the driver's seat. They have the right to change their mind and control their data.
Wow, this act really does give individuals some serious power. It's like they have a data protection lifeguard.
Yeah.
But how does this all get enforced? What's stopping a rogue company from, going rogue?
That's where the Privacy Commissioner comes in, keeping an eye on everything. They have the authority to investigate complaints, issue orders to organizations that aren't playing by the rules, and even impose fines.
So there are actual consequences. It's not just a slap on the wrist.
Definitely not. Those fines can be hefty, enough to make even the most data-hungry company think twice.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Now, let's dive back into those intriguing specifics we mentioned earlier. You mentioned an exemption for communication providers. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Sure. Imagine your super cool GPS swim trunks need to send location data back to your company. That data might pass through various networks run by internet service providers or like telecom companies.
So they're like the underwater cables.
They're carrying the data signals. Exactly. They're the conduits of the digital world. And the Act recognizes that it's not really practical to hold these communication providers responsible for every piece of data that passes through.
Right. It would be like blaming the Postal Service for a bad birthday card.
Exactly. It's about recognizing their unique role. They're facilitators, not controllers.
Okay, that clarifies things. But what about the honors exemption? We're still a bit puzzled by that one. Is it really that big of a deal to keep the nomination process secret?
Well, think about it from the nominee's perspective. Let's say someone is nominated for an award based on their work in, marine conservation. But the nomination process reveals some sensitive personal details, perhaps a past mistake, or a controversial opinion.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
That kind of information could overshadow their accomplishments, even damage their reputation, even if they deserve the award.
Exactly. It's about protecting the individual from unintended consequences. The exemption allows for discretion and confidentiality.
It's like a data shield. Makes sense. Okay, so we've gone through the key principles, those interesting exemptions, and even a hypothetical swim trunk company. What does this all tell us about Bermuda's overall approach to data protection?
Well, I think it shows they're taking it very seriously. They're not just paying lip service. They're putting in place a robust legal framework.
They're not just dipping their toes in the water. They're diving right in.
Exactly. They're aiming for a comprehensive approach that balances those individual rights with the needs of businesses. They're recognizing the challenges of the digital age and crafting laws that can adapt to them.
It's like they're building a data protection fortress with strong walls, careful gatekeepers, and a few secret passages.
That's a great analogy. And within that fortress, they're empowering individuals to take control of their data and exercise their rights.
It's refreshing to see a country taking such a proactive stance. It gives you hope that maybe, just maybe, we can create a digital world where privacy isn't just an afterthought.
I agree. It's a positive sign, for sure. It'll be interesting to see how Bermuda's approach evolves as technology advances and data becomes even more intertwined with our lives.
Absolutely. But before we get swept away by the tides of the future, let's bring it back to the present. I'm curious about the practical side of this act. How does it actually impact consumers like you and me?
Well, let's think about our own online experiences. How often do we just blindly click agree on those cookie banners without even reading the privacy policies?
You mean those walls of text that make my eyes glaze over? Guilty as charged.
We've all been there. But this act reminds us that we have a choice. We have the right to know what data is being collected, how it's being used, and to object if we're not comfortable.
So it's not just about Bermuda, it's about becoming more aware of our data rights, wherever we are.
Exactly. It's about taking a more active role in managing our digital footprint.
It's like we've been sleepwalking through this data landscape, just handing over our information. Without a second thought, this act's a wake-up call.
It is. It reminds us that we have rights. We can exercise them. We don't have to be passive in this whole data game.
Right. We can be data defenders, not just data donors. But it can feel overwhelming, right, with so many companies and websites collecting information. Where do we even start?
Well, think about those cookie banners. Next time you see one, don't just click accept all. Take a moment, actually read it, see what they're collecting and why.
So I should resist the urge to just click and get it over with.
Exactly. Those choices matter. You might decide that you're okay with some data collection, but not others. You have the right to make those distinctions.
Okay, so be more mindful of the cookie banners. What else can we do?
Pay attention to privacy policies.
I know. They're usually long and boring.
Yeah, they're like the digital equivalent of reading the fine print on a loan agreement.
Right. But they can reveal a lot about how a company handles your data. Look for key phrases like data retention, third-party sharing, and data security. So I should be on the lookout for any red flags that make me think, maybe I don't want to give these guys my information.
Exactly. It's like being a data detective, looking for clues.
Data detective on the case. And if we find something fishy, we can use those data rights we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. If a company isn't being transparent or is doing something you don't like, you have the right to speak up. You can contact their customer service, file a complaint with a privacy commissioner, or even take legal action in some cases.
So we're not powerless. We have options.
You do. And the more people who exercise those options, the more these companies will realize they need to take this seriously. It's all about shifting the balance of power.
Right. It's about making data protection a priority, not just a box to check.
And that brings us to a broader point. Data protection isn't just about laws and regulations, it's about ethics and responsibility.
So it's not just about following the rules, it's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that data represents real people, real lives, real stories. We have a moral obligation to treat that data with respect and care.
It's like data has a human face. We need to remember things.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond the technical stuff and remembering the human element.
This whole conversation has been eye-opening. I feel like I've gone from, like, a data newbie to a data ninja, ready to protect my information.
And that's the goal, to empower you with knowledge and awareness so you can navigate this whole data world with confidence.
You've definitely achieved that. Now, before we wrap up, I'd love to leave our listener with one final thought, a question. You've talked about Bermuda's approach, but this is a global issue. So to our listener, we ask you, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about how your data is used online, what would it be? What keeps you up at night?
That's an excellent question. It gets to the heart of what matters to us in this digital age, Is it more transparency, more control, stronger security? The answer is different for everyone, but it's a conversation worth having.
Well said. It's a reminder that we all have a stake in this future. And by being informed, engaged, and vocal, we can help shape a world where data is used responsibly and ethically.
Absolutely. The power is in our hands, collectively. Let's make our voices heard.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of data protection. Remember, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those questions coming.
Until next time.
In this podcast, there could be mistakes, so please check the source material. Enjoy exploring and have a great day.